Sarah Martinez pulled into the courthouse parking lot at exactly 8:45, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel of her 14-year-old Honda Civic. The morning shift at Mel's Diner had started at 5, and she still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease despite her hurried attempt to freshen up in the restaurant's cramped bathroom. Her waitress uniform, a pale yellow dress with grease stains that wouldn't come out no matter how much she scrubbed, was the only professional clothing she owned. Where are you watching this from today? Are you dealing with your own legal battles or family challenges in your state? Sometimes the places we call home become the very courtrooms where our futures get decided. The courthouse loomed before her, all granite columns and intimidating architecture designed to make ordinary people feel small. Sarah gathered her worn purse and a manila folder containing photocopied documents, checking her phone one more time for any last-minute text from her court-appointed attorney. Nothing. Marcus Webb had seemed overwhelmed during their brief consultation, admitting this was only his third custody case since passing the bar 6 months ago. As she walked toward the entrance, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Richard Blackwood emerged from the passenger side, his 6-foot frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his confident smile suggested a man who had never lost anything important in his life. Behind him stepped his new wife, Victoria, a blonde woman 15 years his junior, wearing a cream-colored designer dress and pearls that caught the morning sunlight. Richard spotted Sarah immediately, his smile widening into something that didn't reach his eyes. Well, he called out across the parking lot. If it isn't the breakfast special. Still serving up those eggs over easy, Sarah? Victoria giggled behind her manicured hand, a sound like wind chimes that made Sarah's teeth ache. Sarah ignored them and continued walking, but she could hear Richard's voice carrying across the space between them. I do hope you had time to shower off the maple syrup smell, he continued, his tone dripping with false concern. Wouldn't want the judge to think you can't maintain basic hygiene standards around our children. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity as lawyers in expensive suits conferenced with nervous clients. Sarah felt every eye on her as she approached the information desk. Acutely aware of how out of place, she looked among the sea of tailored clothing and leather briefcases. The security guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, directed her toward the family court wing with a sympathetic nod that suggested he'd seen plenty of people in her situation. Courtroom 4B was smaller than she'd expected, with wooden pews that reminded her uncomfortably of a church. Richard's legal team had already commandeered the front row on the right side. 3 attorneys in matching navy suits hunched over thick files and whispering among themselves. The lead counsel, Helena Frost, was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s whose reputation for destroying opposing parties in custody battles was legendary throughout the county. Sarah slid into the back row on the left side, setting her folder down carefully beside her. Marcus Webb appeared moments later, looking frazzled and juggling an overstuffed briefcase that seemed to leak papers with every step. He was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 28, with nervous energy that did nothing to inspire confidence. Sorry, Marcus muttered as he dropped into the seat beside her, papers scattering across the floor. Traffic was insane, and I had to stop by the office to print some documents. How are you feeling about today? Before Sarah could answer, the bailiff called for all parties to rise as Judge Morrison entered the courtroom. Patricia Morrison was a stern woman in her early 60s, known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for dramatics. She surveyed the assembled crowd with sharp gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Helena Frost rose gracefully, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Your Honor, she began, her tone suggesting this proceeding was merely a formality. We appear today on behalf of Mr. Richard Blackwood in the matter of custody modification for the minor children Emma and James Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood is a successful business owner and community leader who can provide these children with the stable, nurturing environment they deserve. She gestured toward Richard, who had positioned himself to catch the best light from the courtroom windows. He wore an expression of concerned fatherhood, the kind of look that had probably been practiced in front of a mirror. Beside him, Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the caring stepmother to perfection. And representing Ms. Martinez, Judge Morrison asked, her tone neutral but expectant. Marcus Webb jumped to his feet, so quickly he knocked over his water glass, sending droplets cascading across his legal pad. Yes, Your Honor, Marcus stammered, Marcus Webb for the respondent. Ms. Martinez is a devoted mother who has been the primary caregiver for these children throughout their lives, and she opposes any modification to the current custody arrangement. The judge's eyes moved to Sarah, taking in her appearance with professional detachment. Ms. Martinez, she said, I want you to understand that custody determinations are made based on the best interests of the children involved. Financial stability, housing conditions, and the ability to provide educational and emotional support are all factors this court will consider. Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She understood perfectly what the judge was really saying. In a battle between a wealthy businessman and a waitress living paycheck to paycheck, the outcome seemed predetermined. Helena Frost smiled, a predator sensing weakness in her prey. Your Honor, she continued, Mr. Blackwood has prepared extensive documentation regarding his client's financial stability and living situation. We believe the evidence will clearly demonstrate that the children's best interests would be served by a modification granting primary custody to Mr. Blackwood, with appropriate visitation schedules for Ms. Martinez. The words hung in the air like a threat, and Sarah could feel the weight of expectation from everyone in the courtroom. But something strange happened as she sat there listening to Helena's confident pronouncements. Instead of the crushing despair she'd expected to feel, Sarah found herself checking her phone, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She glanced up to find Richard watching her, his expression puzzled by her apparent lack of distress. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and for just a moment, Sarah allowed her smile to widen. Richard's confident expression faltered slightly, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. Helena Frost opened her briefcase with theatrical precision, withdrawing a thick folder that she placed prominently on the table before addressing the court. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had destroyed countless opponents in this very courtroom. I would like to present evidence regarding Ms. Martinez's employment history and current financial situation, which I believe will demonstrate her inability to provide adequate care for these children. She approached the bench with a stack of documents, her heels clicking against the polished floor with metronomic regularity. Ms. Martinez has worked as a waitress at Mel's Diner for the past 7 years, Helena continued, her tone suggesting this was equivalent to a criminal conviction. Her current wages, even with tips, place her well below the poverty line for a family of 3. The documentation shows she has been late on rent payments 6 times in the past 2 years and has had her electricity shut off twice for non-payment. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the courtroom as Helena painted a picture of financial desperation that wasn't entirely inaccurate. The gallery, filled with Richard's business associates and Victoria's social circle, murmured among themselves with the kind of satisfied whispers that suggested they were witnessing exactly what they'd expected. Marcus Webb rose unsteadily to his feet, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted an objection. Your Honor, Ms. Martinez's employment status doesn't reflect her dedication as a mother or her ability to provide a loving home for her children. Judge Morrison nodded curtly. Overruled, Mr. Webb. Financial stability is indeed a relevant factor in custody determinations. Please continue, Ms. Frost. Helena's smile could have cut glass. Thank you, Your Honor. She returned to her table and retrieved a set of glossy photographs that she presented to the court with flourish. These images show Ms. Martinez's current living situation, a 2-bedroom apartment in the Riverside complex, which has been cited multiple times by the Housing Authority for maintenance violations and pest control issues. The photographs passed from the judge to the court clerk, each image a stark reminder of Sarah's modest circumstances. The small living room with its second-hand furniture, the children's bedroom with twin beds pushed against opposite walls, the kitchen with its outdated appliances and peeling linoleum flooring. In contrast, Helena produced an equally impressive set of photographs showcasing Richard's sprawling colonial mansion with its manicured grounds and swimming pool. Now, Helena continued, turning to face the gallery with the confidence of someone playing to a friendly audience. I would like to call Mrs. Victoria Blackwood to testify about the stable home environment she and Mr. Blackwood can provide." Victoria rose gracefully, smoothing her designer dress as she approached the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible with practiced solemnity, her performance so polished it could have been choreographed. After being sworn in, she settled into the witness chair with the poise of someone comfortable being the center of attention. "Mrs. Blackwood," Helena began, "please tell the court about your background and qualifications as a maternal figure for Emma and James." Victoria's voice was soft and cultured, each word carefully enunciated. "I have a degree in early childhood development from Pemberton College, and I've been working with children in various capacities for over a decade. When Richard and I married last year, I made it my priority to create a nurturing environment where Emma and James could thrive academically and emotionally." She paused to dab at her eyes with her handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to move several members of the gallery. "The children have their own bedrooms in our home, each decorated according to their personal interests. Emma has a princess theme with a canopy bed, while James has a space-themed room complete with a telescope for stargazing. We've enrolled them in private tutoring sessions and extracurricular activities that simply weren't available to them before." Marcus Webb attempted another objection, his voice gaining slightly more conviction. "Your Honor, Mrs. Blackwood's testimony assumes facts not in evidence about the quality of care the children received with Ms. Martinez." "Sustained," Judge Morrison replied, but she seemed more interested in Helena's presentation than in protecting Sarah from further humiliation. "Mrs. Blackwood, please limit your testimony to your own observations and capabilities." "Of course, Your Honor," Victoria replied with the apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What I can say is that the children have expressed excitement about having their own space and the opportunities available to them in our home. Emma particularly enjoys the piano lessons we've arranged, and James has shown remarkable progress in his mathematics tutoring." Helena nodded approvingly. "And regarding Ms. Martinez's current living situation, have you observed any concerns about the children's welfare during their visitation periods?" Victoria's expression shifted to one of practiced concern. Without wanting to speak ill of anyone, she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried perfectly throughout the small courtroom. "The children have mentioned feeling embarrassed about bringing friends over to their mother's apartment. Emma specifically asked if she could have her birthday party at our house, because she was worried about the other children seeing where she lives." A collective murmur of sympathy arose from the gallery, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She knew Emma had never said any such thing, but the lie was delivered with such conviction that even Judge Morrison seemed affected by it. Richard took the stand next, his testimony a masterclass in concerned fatherhood mixed with subtle condescension. He spoke eloquently about his business success, his community involvement, and his deep love for his children. When Helena asked about his concerns regarding Sarah's parenting, his response was carefully crafted to sound reluctant. "I don't want to criticize Sarah," he began, his voice heavy with false reluctance. "She's tried her best with limited resources, but the reality is that she simply cannot provide the opportunities these children deserve." When James expressed interest in joining the robotics club at school, Sarah had to tell him they couldn't afford the participation fee. When Emma needed a dress for her school's spring dance, Sarah made her wear something from the thrift store that was 3 sizes too large. The gallery erupted in soft gasps and murmurs of disapproval, the sound washing over Sarah like a wave of collective judgment. Richard continued, warming to his theme as he saw the effect his words were having on the courtroom. "I'm not asking for this custody modification out of spite or anger," he said, his voice rising with apparent emotion. "I'm asking because I can't stand to watch my children suffer from poverty when I have the means to give them everything they need. Sarah works doubles at that diner just to keep the lights on, which means the children are often left with unreliable babysitters or forced to sit in the restaurant's break room doing homework while she works." Helena nodded sympathetically. "And you're prepared to provide financial support for the children's needs?" "Absolutely," Richard replied without hesitation. "Private school tuition, college savings accounts, medical and dental coverage that goes far beyond basic care. These children could have every advantage in life, but only if they're allowed to live in a stable environment where those advantages can be properly utilized." Marcus Webb's cross-examination was painful to watch, his inexperience showing with every fumbled question and weak challenge. Richard deflected each attempt at criticism with practiced ease, turning every question into another opportunity to highlight his superior qualifications as a parent. The most damaging moment came when Marcus asked about Richard's work schedule, clearly hoping to establish that he was too busy to be a Hanson parent. Instead, Richard smiled benevolently and explained how his successful business allowed him the flexibility to attend every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered in his children's lives. Unlike some people, Richard concluded with devastating precision, "I don't have to choose between being present for my children and paying the bills. I can do both without forcing them to sacrifice their childhood to my financial limitations." Throughout the entire proceeding, Sarah sat with remarkable composure, occasionally glancing at her phone with what appeared to be mild amusement. Her behavior was so contrary to what everyone expected that even Judge Morrison found herself stealing glances at the defendant, clearly puzzled by Sarah's apparent lack of distress. Helena concluded her opening presentation with a passionate speech about the children's best interests, painting Richard as a savior and Sarah as a well-meaning, but ultimately inadequate mother whose poverty disqualified her from providing proper care. The gallery nodded along with every word, their expressions suggesting they viewed this as less of a legal proceeding and more of an inevitable correction to an unfortunate situation. As Helena returned to her seat, basking in the apparent success of her performance, Sarah checked her phone one final time and smiled. The expression was so confident, so mysteriously satisfied, that Richard found himself staring at her with growing unease. Something about her demeanor suggested this wasn't going according to the script he'd written in his mind. Marcus Webb's phone rang just as Judge Morrison was preparing to call for the next phase of testimony. The shrill sound cut through the courtroom's tense atmosphere, causing every head to turn toward the defense table where Marcus fumbled frantically to silence the device. His face flushed crimson as he glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from embarrassment to alarm. "Your Honor," Marcus stammered, rising unsteadily to his feet, "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to take this call. It's regarding an emergency motion in another case that requires my immediate attention." Judge Morrison's expression darkened with the kind of displeasure that suggested Marcus had just committed a cardinal sin of courtroom etiquette. "Mr. Webb," she replied icily, "this court does not appreciate such unprofessional conduct. How long do you anticipate this interruption will last?" Marcus glanced at his phone again, his hands visibly shaking as he read what appeared to be a series of urgent text messages. "I'm afraid it could be several hours, Your Honor. There's been a development in a criminal case that requires my immediate presence at the county jail for client consultation." Helena Frost practically purred with satisfaction as she rose from her seat. "Your Honor, if opposing counsel is unable to fulfill his obligations to his client, perhaps we should consider postponing these proceedings until Ms. Martinez can secure adequate representation." The suggestion hung in the air like a trap, designed to force Sarah into an impossible choice between accepting a delay that would benefit Richard's case or proceeding without legal counsel. Sarah felt the weight of expectation from everyone in the courtroom, their faces reflecting a mixture of pity and anticipation as they waited for her inevitable capitulation. Instead, Sarah stood calmly and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a clarity and confidence that immediately commanded attention, "I would like to represent myself for the remainder of these proceedings." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, with several members of the gallery exchanging incredulous glances. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her eyebrows raised in genuine concern. "Ms. Martinez," she said carefully, "while you have the right to represent yourself, I must strongly advise against it in a case of this complexity. Custody law involves numerous procedural requirements and evidentiary standards that can be challenging even for experienced attorneys." Sarah's smile was steady and reassuring. "I understand the risks, Your Honor, and I appreciate the court's concern. However, I am confident in my ability to advocate for myself and my children. I've been preparing for this possibility and have all necessary documentation ready for presentation." She reached into her worn purse and withdrew a leather portfolio that none of them had noticed before. The folder was pristine, organized with colored tabs, and containing what appeared to be professionally prepared legal documents. The transformation from overwhelmed waitress to composed litigant was so dramatic that even Helena Frost found herself staring in confusion. Richard leaned forward in his seat, his earlier confidence beginning to crack as he watched Sarah arrange her materials with the kind of systematic precision that suggested extensive legal knowledge. This wasn't the desperate, flailing performance he'd expected from someone forced to represent herself. "Very well," Judge Morrison said after a moment of consideration. "Mr. Webb, you are excused from these proceedings. Ms. Martinez, you may continue, but I will not hesitate to intervene if I believe you are prejudicing your own case through inadequate representation." Marcus gathered his papers with obvious relief and practically fled the courtroom, leaving Sarah alone at the defense table. She took a moment to review her notes, her demeanor so calm and professional that the gallery's amused whispers began to fade into uncertain silence. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she'd done this before, "I would like to request the opportunity to cross-examine Mrs. Blackwood regarding certain inconsistencies in her earlier testimony." Helena shot to her feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness has already been excused, and opposing counsel," she paused meaningfully, or rather, the pro-se respondent, "had the opportunity for cross-examination during the appropriate time." Sarah remained standing, her expression patient but determined. "Your Honor, during direct examination, Mrs. Blackwood made several specific claims about conversations with my children that I believe require clarification. Given that this testimony directly impacts the court's determination of the children's best interests, I request permission to explore these statements further." Judge Morrison considered the request for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I'll allow limited questioning, Ms. Martinez, but please be mindful of the scope and relevance of your inquiries." Victoria returned to the witness stand with considerably less confidence than she displayed during her initial testimony. Her designer dress suddenly seemed less armor-like and more costume-like as Sarah approached the podium with a legal pad covered in precise handwriting. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah began, her voice professional and measured, "you testified that my daughter Emma asked to have her birthday party at your house because she was embarrassed about her current living situation. Can you tell me specifically when this conversation took place?" Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier poise beginning to crack. "Well," she stammered, "it was sometime in the past few months. I don't recall the exact date." Sarah nodded and made a note on her pad. "Was this conversation during a scheduled visitation period, or did it occur at some other time?" "During visitation," Victoria replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The children often share their feelings with me when they're staying with us." Sarah consulted her notes with the kind of attention to detail that made Helena Frost increasingly uncomfortable. According to the court-ordered visitation schedule, Mrs. Blackwood, Emma has not had an overnight stay at your residence since December 15th of last year. Her birthday is March 22nd. Are you saying this conversation took place more than 3 months before her actual birthday? Victoria's face flushed as she realized the trap she'd walked into. She began, then stopped, glancing desperately toward Helena for help. "Perhaps I was thinking of another occasion, or maybe it was about a different event." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was steel in her voice as she continued. "Mrs. Blackwood, you also testified that James mentioned feeling embarrassed about bringing friends to my apartment. Can you describe the specific circumstances under which my 10-year-old son shared these alleged feelings with you?" The questioning continued with surgical precision, each inquiry exposing another inconsistency in Victoria's testimony. Sarah demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the visitation schedule, the children's school calendar, and even the specific dates of events that Victoria claimed to have witnessed. With each exposed contradiction, the gallery's mood shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching concern. Helena objected repeatedly, her voice growing sharper with each intervention. "Argumentative, Your Honor. Asked and answered, beyond the scope of direct examination." But Judge Morrison seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's line of questioning, overruling most of the objections and allowing the cross-examination to continue. The most damaging moment came when Sarah produced a school calendar and asked Victoria to identify the date of Emma's supposed spring dance. Victoria confidently stated it had been in April, only to have Sarah point out that the school's spring dance was scheduled for May and hadn't occurred yet. The testimony about Emma wearing an ill-fitting thrift store dress crumbled completely when Sarah demonstrated that the event Victoria described hadn't even taken place. By the time Sarah concluded her questioning, Victoria looked shaken and defensive, her earlier testimony revealed as a collection of fabrications and assumptions. The gallery, which had initially seemed charmed by her maternal concern, now watched her with obvious skepticism. Richard's face had grown progressively darker throughout the cross-examination, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching panic as he watched his carefully constructed case begin to unravel. When Helena attempted to rehabilitate Victoria during redirect examination, Sarah's precise objections consistently disrupted the flow of questions. "Your Honor," Richard suddenly stood, his voice carrying the kind of desperation that suggested a man watching his plans disintegrate in real time. "I believe this court deserves to see the complete financial picture of both parties before making any custody determinations. I demand immediate financial disclosure from Ms. Martinez to demonstrate her ongoing inability to provide adequate support for our children." The request was exactly the kind of overreach that Sarah had been waiting for, the fatal mistake that would provide her with the opening she needed. Helena tried to restrain her client with a sharp look, clearly recognizing that he was making a tactical error, but Richard was beyond listening to counsel. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow at the irregular demand. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "financial disclosure is typically handled through proper motions and discovery procedures, not spontaneous demands during testimony." Sarah's smile was subtle but unmistakable as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I have no objection to Mr. Blackwood's request for immediate financial disclosure. In fact, I welcome the opportunity to present a complete and accurate picture of my financial situation to the court." She reached for her phone with the kind of calm confidence that made Richard suddenly wish he could take back his words. The device in her hand seemed to glow with possibility as she checked for what appeared to be an expected notification, her smile widening slightly as she found exactly what she was looking for. The court clerk appeared in the doorway carrying a thick manila envelope, his timing so perfect that Sarah might have orchestrated his entrance herself. "Your Honor," he announced, "the additional documentation requested by Ms. Martinez has arrived from the county records office." Judge Morrison gestured for him to approach the bench, and Sarah rose smoothly from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying newfound authority that made several gallery members shift uncomfortably. "I requested these documents yesterday in anticipation of Mr. Blackwood's financial disclosure demand. I believe the court will find them highly relevant to determining the children's best interests." Helena Frost exchanged a worried glance with Richard, neither of them quite able to mask their growing unease. What possible documentation could a waitress have requested that would impact these proceedings? Richard's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of nervous energy that suggested a man beginning to realize he'd miscalculated badly. Sarah accepted the envelope from the clerk and opened it with deliberate care, withdrawing a series of official documents that she spread across her table with practiced efficiency. The papers bore the seals of various government agencies, lending them an air of authority that immediately commanded Judge Morrison's attention. "Your Honor," Sarah began, walking to the podium with the composed stride of someone comfortable in a courtroom, "I would like to present evidence regarding Mr. Blackwood's actual financial situation, which I believe differs significantly from the picture painted by his counsel." She placed the first document before the judge, her movements precise and professional. "This is a filing from the Secretary of State's office showing that Blackwood Enterprises, Mr. Blackwood's primary business, has been in default on its annual registration fees for 8 months. The company currently faces administrative dissolution proceedings." Richard shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation and something that might have been fear. He sputtered. "Those are temporary administrative issues that are being resolved by my accountant. The business remains profitable and stable." Sarah's expression remained neutral as she produced another document. "Your Honor, this is a notice from the Internal Revenue Service indicating that Mr. Blackwood owes approximately $230,000 in back taxes and penalties. The notice is dated 6 weeks ago and indicates that collection proceedings have been initiated. The gallery erupted in surprised murmurs, their earlier certainty about Richard's financial stability beginning to crack. Helena Frost attempted to object, but Judge Morrison was clearly interested in seeing where this line of evidence led. Additionally, Sarah continued, producing a thick stack of papers. These are copies of 3 separate lawsuits filed against Blackwood Enterprises in the past 18 months. The first involves breach of contract with a major client resulting in damages of $400,000. The second concerns failure to pay vendor invoices totaling nearly $100,000. The third is a class action suit filed by former employees alleging wage theft and benefits fraud. Richard's face had gone pale, his earlier bluster replaced by the kind of desperate panic that comes from watching carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. Those lawsuits are frivolous, he protested weakly. Disgruntled employees and vindictive competitors trying to damage my reputation. Sarah nodded acknowledgingly, her tone remaining professional and measured. Perhaps, Mr. Blackwood, but I believe the court should also be aware of Mrs. Blackwood's role in some of these irregularities. Victoria, who had been sitting quietly since her disastrous testimony, suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes wide with alarm. I don't understand what you're implying, she said quickly, her cultured voice cracking slightly. Sarah produced another document, this one bearing an official notary seal. Mrs. Blackwood, you signed documents as Secretary of Blackwood Enterprises authorizing the transfer of company funds to personal accounts controlled by you and your husband. According to these bank records, over $300,000 was moved from business accounts to personal use in the 6 months following your marriage. Helena Frost was on her feet immediately, her voice sharp with desperation. Objection, Your Honor. This is far beyond the scope of custody proceedings and constitutes a fishing expedition into irrelevant financial matters. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Ms. Frost, you and your client specifically requested financial disclosure from Ms. Martinez. It seems only fair that similar scrutiny be applied to Mr. Blackwood's claims about his ability to provide financial stability. The logic was unassailable, and Helena found herself forced back into her seat, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Richard looked like a man watching his world collapse, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Sarah continued her methodical destruction of Richard's case, producing evidence of bounced checks, unpaid mortgages, and creditor liens that painted a picture of financial desperation hidden beneath a veneer of success. With each revelation, the gallery's mood shifted further from supportive to suspicious, several of Richard's business associates beginning to eye the exits, as if contemplating their own potential exposure. But Your Honor, Sarah said, pausing dramatically as she organized her remaining documents, the most relevant information concerns how I obtained these records and what my investigation revealed about my own situation. She turned to face Richard directly, her expression calm but unmistakably triumphant. Mr. Blackwood, you've spent considerable time today characterizing me as a struggling waitress with no prospects and limited intelligence. What you failed to realize is that for the past 3 years, I haven't just been serving coffee and taking orders. I've been conducting one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud investigations in this state's history. The courtroom fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that suggested everyone present was holding their breath. Richard's mouth fell open, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked shock as the implications of Sarah's words began to sink in. I am a certified fraud examiner and licensed private investigator, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. I took the job at Mel's Diner because it was the perfect cover for investigating a network of businesses suspected of money laundering, tax evasion, and securities fraud. What started as a routine surveillance assignment became something much more significant when I discovered the scope of the criminal enterprise involved. Helena Frost looked as though she might be sick, her sharp features pale and drawn as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. You mean to tell this court, she said weakly, that you've been working undercover this entire time? Sarah nodded, producing a leather credential case from her purse. Your Honor, I have my investigator's license, fraud examiner certification, and documentation from the Attorney General's office authorizing my investigation. What began as monitoring suspicious transactions at several local businesses expanded into a multi-million-dollar case involving corporate conspiracy, racketeering, and systematic fraud. She paused to glance at her phone, which had been buzzing intermittently throughout her presentation. The screen showed several missed calls and text messages, all marked urgent. "Your Honor," she said, "I believe I've just received the notification I've been waiting for. The investigation I've been conducting for the past 3 years reached its conclusion this morning." Judge Morrison leaned forward, clearly intrigued despite herself. "Ms. Martinez, while this information is certainly relevant to questions about your background and capabilities, how does it relate to the financial disclosure Mr. Blackwood demanded?" Sarah's smile was quiet but unmistakable. "Your Honor, I would like to request permission to present one final piece of evidence via the court's digital display system. I believe it will provide the complete financial picture that Mr. Blackwood felt was so essential to these proceedings." The judge nodded slowly, gesturing toward the large monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. The bailiff activated the system, and Sarah approached with her phone, connecting it to the display with the kind of technical competence that suggested she'd done this before. The screen illuminated, showing Sarah's mobile banking application. For a moment, the numbers were too large to process, the digits seeming to blur together as everyone in the courtroom struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. $45 million. The amount sat in Sarah's account like an accusation, the wire transfer notification timestamp showing it had arrived just 20 minutes earlier. The description line read, "Settlement Payment, Attorney General Investigation, Case Number 2024 AG0847. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Victoria's sharp intake of breath and the rustle of papers as Helena Frost frantically searched through her files as if looking for some explanation that could make sense of what she was witnessing. Richard stared at the screen with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew. The waitress he'd been mocking and humiliating for months was worth more than he could ever dream of earning, and she'd been investigating crimes that could destroy not just his custody case, but his freedom. "Your Honor," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the stunned courtroom with crystalline clarity, "I believe this addresses Mr. Blackwood's concerns about my ability to provide financial stability for our children." Judge Morrison stared at the screen for a long moment, her judicial composure struggling to mask her astonishment at the astronomical figure displayed before the entire courtroom. The $45 million settlement amount seemed to pulse with significance, transforming every assumption that had been made about these proceedings. "Ms. Martinez," the judge said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of someone trying to process a completely unexpected development, "I believe this court requires an explanation of the source and nature of this substantial settlement payment." Sarah disconnected her phone from the display system and returned to the podium, her movements calm and deliberate despite the chaos she had just unleashed. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and professional. "This settlement represents compensation from a federal whistleblower lawsuit filed under the False Claims Act against Meridian Industries, one of the largest defense contractors in the region." She produced another document from her seemingly endless supply of legal papers, this one bearing federal government seals and official signatures. "For the past 3 years, I have been working as an undercover investigator documenting systematic fraud in their government contracting division. The company was billing the Department of Defense for services never rendered and materials never delivered, while simultaneously laundering money through a network of shell companies and subsidiary businesses." Richard's face had gone ashen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated as he began to understand the magnitude of what Sarah was revealing. "You mean," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've been investigating federal crimes this whole time?" Sarah nodded calmly. "The investigation led to criminal charges against 14 individuals, recovery of over $200 million in fraudulent billings, and the largest whistleblower settlement in this district's history. My role as a waitress at Mel's Diner provided perfect cover for monitoring financial transactions at businesses connected to the money laundering operation." Victoria suddenly stood from her seat, her face pale and her hands trembling as she gathered her purse with obvious panic. "I need to," she began, But her words were cut off as the bailiff stepped forward, blocking her path to the exit. "Mrs. Blackwood," Judge Morrison said sharply, "please remain seated. These proceedings are not concluded." Helena Frost was frantically shuffling through her papers, her earlier confidence completely shattered as she realized the devastating implications of her client's situation. "Your Honor," she said desperately, her voice cracking with strain, "I move to withdraw all previous testimony regarding Ms. Martinez's financial fitness to provide for the children." Clearly, the information presented earlier was based on incomplete understanding of her circumstances. The motion hung in the air like a white flag of surrender, but Judge Morrison's expression suggested she was far from ready to accept such a simple resolution. "Ms. Frost," she replied coolly, "your client specifically demanded immediate financial disclosure from Ms. Martinez. Having received exactly what he requested, he cannot now claim ignorance of the consequences." Richard was staring at Sarah with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion. He seemed unable to process the complete reversal of their positions, his mouth moving soundlessly as he struggled to find words that could somehow undo the catastrophe unfolding around him. The gallery, which had spent the morning smugly watching what they believed would be Sarah's humiliation, now sat in stunned silence. Several of Richard's business associates were staring at their phones, likely calculating their own exposure to whatever investigation Sarah had been conducting. The social supporters who had come to witness Victoria's triumph were edging toward the exits, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years building an unshakable case, "I have additional documentation showing that Mr. Blackwood's claimed net worth of $12 million is not only inaccurate, but represents assets that are either encumbered by liens or obtained through questionable means." She produced yet another set of documents, her preparation so thorough that it suggested she had anticipated every possible turn the proceedings might take. According to these financial records subpoenaed as part of the federal investigation, Mr. Blackwood's actual liquid assets total approximately $47,000. His home is facing foreclosure proceedings, his business accounts have been frozen pending resolution of the tax liens, and his luxury vehicles are all leased through arrangements that are currently in default. Richard's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed facade of success crumbling with each revelation. "Sarah," he pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation, "you have to understand, I didn't know who you really were. The way you were living, the job at the diner, I had no idea." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was steel in her voice as she responded. "Mr. Blackwood, you spent months mocking my employment, questioning my fitness as a mother, and attempting to use your perceived financial advantage to take my children away from me. The fact that you base these actions on assumptions and prejudice rather than facts does not make them less harmful or more forgivable." Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, clearly struggling to process the complete reversal of everything she had expected from these proceedings. "Ms. Martinez," she said slowly, "am I to understand that your apparent financial hardship was entirely fabricated as part of your undercover work?" "Not fabricated, Your Honor," Sarah corrected gently. "I genuinely did work as a waitress and live in modest circumstances. That was necessary to maintain my cover and ensure the integrity of the investigation. However, I was being compensated for my investigative work throughout this period, and I always had access to resources that I chose not to use in order to protect the operation." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "The children," she said desperately, "what about Emma and James? They've been living in that apartment, believing their mother was struggling financially." Sarah's expression softened slightly as she addressed the concern. "My children have been aware of my work within age-appropriate limits, Mrs. Blackwood. They understand that I have an important job that sometimes requires me to pretend to be something I'm not. They've never suffered from genuine financial hardship, and they've always known they were safe and provided for." The judge reviewed the financial documents Sarah had presented, her eyebrows rising with each page as she absorbed the true scope of the wealth disparity between the parties. "Ms. Martinez," she said finally, "these documents indicate that your net worth, including the settlement, exceeds $50 million. Is this accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied simply. In addition to the whistleblower settlement, I have investment accounts, real estate holdings, and other assets accumulated through my investigative work and careful financial planning. I can provide complete documentation of all holdings if the court requires it. Richard buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the full weight of his situation finally registered. Not only had he lost any chance of gaining custody of his children, but his fraudulent business practices had been exposed in open court. His wife was potentially facing criminal charges, and his reputation in the community was completely destroyed. Helena Frost made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Your Honor," she said weakly, "perhaps the court might consider that Mr. Blackwood's actions, while misguided, were motivated by genuine concern for his children's welfare." Judge Morrison's expression suggested she found this argument less than compelling. "Miss Frost," she replied coldly, "your client's actions appear to have been motivated primarily by arrogance and a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. The court does not look favorably upon parties who attempt to manipulate proceedings through false representations and character assassination." Judge Morrison set down her gavel with the finality of someone who had witnessed enough drama for one day. After reviewing all evidence presented, she announced, "This court finds that the best interests of the minor children Emma and James are clearly served by maintaining primary custody with their mother, Miss Sarah Martinez." The words echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for Richard's hopes, each syllable driving home the magnitude of his defeat. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, given the substantial misrepresentations made by Mr. Blackwood regarding both his own financial status and Ms. Martinez's capabilities, this court is awarding full custody to Ms. Martinez, with supervised visitation rights for Mr. Blackwood pending resolution of the criminal investigations referenced in today's proceedings. Richard's strangled gasp was audible throughout the courtroom, but Judge Morrison was far from finished. "Additionally," she said, her tone growing increasingly stern, "Mr. Blackwood will be responsible for all court costs and legal fees associated with these proceedings, including compensation for Ms. Martinez's time and the considerable expense of gathering the evidence presented today." Helena Frost looked as though she might collapse, her professional reputation crumbling as thoroughly as her client's case. She attempted one last objection, her voice weak and desperate. "Your Honor, perhaps the court might consider a graduated approach to custody modification." The suggestion was met with Judge Morrison's coldest stare. "Ms. Frost," she replied icily, "your client's conduct today has demonstrated both a fundamental lack of honesty and a willingness to manipulate legal proceedings for personal gain. This court sees no reason to reward such behavior with partial custody rights." Victoria had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the judge's pronouncement. Her earlier composure completely shattered as the reality of her situation became clear. As Judge Morrison detailed the potential criminal charges related to the fraudulent business documents Victoria had signed, she suddenly bolted from her seat and rushed toward the courtroom exit. Her high heels clicked frantically against the polished floor as she pushed past the other gallery members, her designer dress torn slightly in her panic to escape. "Stop her," Richard called out desperately, but Victoria was already through the doors, abandoning him to face the consequences of their shared deception alone. The bailiff made no move to pursue her, clearly under instructions from Judge Morrison to maintain order in the courtroom rather than chase fleeing witnesses. Richard watched his wife's retreat with the expression of a man realizing he would face his downfall completely alone, stripped of both allies and illusions. The gallery, which had arrived expecting to witness Sarah's humiliation, now sat in stunned silence as the true scope of the reversal became clear. Several of Richard's business associates were quietly gathering their belongings, clearly eager to distance themselves from someone whose financial crimes had been exposed in such public and devastating fashion. Judge Morrison turned her attention to the formal custody arrangements, her tone becoming more administrative as she outlined the new parameters of Richard's limited access to his children. "All visitation will be supervised by court-appointed personnel," she explained, "and Mr. Blackwood will submit to random financial audits to ensure compliance with child support obligations." The courtroom doors opened again, and Emma and James entered with the social worker who had been monitoring them during the proceedings. The children, 10 and 8 years old respectively, looked confused by the formal setting but brightened immediately when they saw Sarah standing confidently at the front of the room. "Mom," Emma called out, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom as she rushed towards Sarah with obvious relief. James followed close behind, his small face beaming with pride as he took in his mother's professional demeanor and the respectful way the court officials were treating her. Sarah knelt to embrace both children, her composure finally cracking slightly as she held them close. The gallery watched this reunion with a mixture of emotions, many clearly struggling to reconcile their earlier assumptions about Sarah with the reality of her true circumstances. Richard attempted to approach his children, his face desperate with the need to explain or justify what had happened. "Emma and James," he began, but Judge Morrison's sharp voice cut him off immediately. "Mr. Blackwood," she said firmly, "you will have no contact with the minor children outside of the supervised visitation schedule that will be established by the court. Any violation of this order will result in immediate termination of your parental rights." The finality of the statement seemed to break whatever remaining fight Richard had left in him. He sank into his chair, his expensive suit rumpled and his carefully styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration and despair. Helena Frost approached the bench one final time, her voice barely above a whisper as she addressed Judge Morrison. "Your Honor, I would like to formally withdraw as counsel for Mr. Blackwood. Recent developments have created an irreconcilable conflict of interest that prevents me from continuing representation." The withdrawal was granted immediately, leaving Richard not only defeated but abandoned by everyone who had supported his case. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the man who had spent the morning mocking Sarah's modest legal representation now found himself completely without counsel. As the formal proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Sarah gathered her children and her impeccably organized legal documents. The transformation from struggling waitress to victorious litigant was complete, but her demeanor remained gracious despite the magnitude of her triumph. 3 months later, the Riverside Diner buzzed with its usual morning activity as Sarah moved efficiently between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking breakfast orders with the same professional competence she had always displayed. Her waitress uniform was clean and pressed, her smile genuine as she served regular customers who had no idea they were being waited on by one of the wealthiest women in the state. Emma and James sat in their usual booth, working on homework before school while their mother finished her shift. The apartment above Mel's Diner had been transformed into a comfortable temporary residence, though Sarah had purchased a magnificent estate on the outskirts of town that remained unoccupied while she decided whether maintaining her cover was still necessary. Richard had been arrested 2 weeks after the custody hearing, charged with multiple counts of tax evasion and business fraud. Victoria had disappeared completely, though rumors suggested she had fled to her family's home in another state. Helena Frost's law practice had suffered irreparable damage from the public exposure of her role in the fraudulent custody case. Sarah poured coffee for a regular customer, an elderly gentleman who had been coming to Mel's for 15 years. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I always figured there was more to you than met the eye. You handle everything with such confidence, like you've got some secret that keeps you calm no matter what happens." Sarah smiled and topped off his cup. "Sometimes the best secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight," she replied, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence that had destroyed Richard's case and restored justice to her family's life. "What about you? Have you ever had to stay strong during a situation where everyone underestimated you? Sometimes the people who think they know our whole story are the ones who understand us the least, but that can become their greatest weakness when the truth finally comes to light."